Nobody touches him. I'm not saying it twice. The waiting room of Southfield Animal Medical Center went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone suddenly finds something very interesting to look at on the floor. A woman with a tabby cat pulled her carrier an inch closer to her ankle. A teenage boy holding a hamster cage stopped chewing his gum. Even the receptionist, who had seen 30 years of difficult clients walk through that door, found a reason to study her computer screen with intense concentration. Sergeant First Class Breckin Shaw stood in the center of the room like he'd been placed there, feet shoulder-width apart, jaw set, one hand wrapped tight around a leather leash. He was still in uniform, not because he'd come straight from duty, Adara Towe noticed, but because the uniform was the point. The rank patches, the ranger tab, the posture that said, "I have been in places you cannot imagine and I came back from all of them." The leash in his hand led to a Belgian Malinois, 75 pounds of coiled muscle, amber eyes scanning the room in slow arcs, ears pinned back in a way that was not aggression, but something more complicated than that. Adara had been walking from the back corridor with a file folder in her hands when she heard him say it. She stopped in the doorway for a moment and watched. The dog's name was on the intake form, Forge. Working K9, 7 years old, MWD designation, referred by on-base veterinary services because of what the notes called persistent appetite disruption and behavioral changes. The base vet had written a longer note in the margin that Adara had read twice before Shaw arrived. Handler reports animal has not eaten adequately in 11 days, responding to commands but effect flat. Recommend behavioral consult alongside physical eval. Handler resistant to this framing, proceed carefully. She clipped the folder under her arm and walked into the waiting room. Sergeant Shaw. She kept her voice even and professional. I'm Adara Towe. I'll be doing Forge's intake assessment before Dr. Olin comes in. He looked at her the way men like him sometimes looked at her, cataloging her in under 2 seconds, filing her under a category, moving on. She was 5'4", in teal scrubs, with a ponytail and no military insignia of any kind. The category he filed her in was obvious from the way his expression didn't change at all. The doctor, he said. It wasn't a question. The vet tech. Dr. Olin will be with you for the examination itself. I handle the intake. Shaw's gaze went to the dog and then back to her, and something in his face hardened in a way that had nothing to do with her specifically. He doesn't do well with strangers. Most of our patients don't, Adara said. That's usually why they're here. He didn't find that funny. She hadn't expected him to. He's bitten 3 people in the last month. Shaw said it flatly, like he was reading from a report. Handlers he's worked with for years. He'll give warning, but the warning is short. Adara looked at Forge. The dog was doing that slow arc scan of the room again, head low, not making eye contact with anyone. She'd seen that posture before. Not in animals that were dangerous, but in animals that were exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. I'll need to get close enough to check his temperature and do a basic assessment, she said. If you want to stay in the room, I'm not leaving him. That's fine, I wasn't going to ask you to. She led them down the hall to exam room 2, the largest one, and Shaw brought Forge through the door with a kind of controlled urgency that made the space feel smaller than it was. Forge swept the room the same way he'd swept the waiting area, systematic, methodical. 7 years of training didn't stop just because the handler was scared. And Shaw was scared. Adara could see it under everything else, not of the dog, for him. She set the folder on the counter and turned to face them both. Forge was sitting now, pressed against Shaw's leg, which was interesting, not seeking comfort, offering it, or trying to. The dog knew something was wrong and didn't know what to do about it any more than his handler did. How long has he been off his food? She asked. 11 days. Shaw's voice was controlled. He'll eat if I put the bowl in front of him and stay there. Couple bites, then stops. Is he drinking? Yes. Sleeping. Pacing at night mostly. Sleeps a few hours before 300, then up. A pause. I know what it looks like. What does it look like? His jaw tightened, like he's depressed. What do you think it is? I don't know. That's why I'm here. Adara pulled a pair of gloves from the dispenser and snapped them on slowly. She didn't move toward the dog. She crouched down instead, getting below Shaw's eye level. below Forge's eye level, and she stayed there a moment without doing anything at all. "When did his previous handler die?" she asked quietly. The silence in the room went from neutral to something else entirely. Shaw's voice, when it came, had dropped. "How did you?" His affect, the way he checks the room. He's not scanning for threats. She kept her eyes on Forge, not on the man. He's looking for someone who isn't there. Shaw didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was flat in the way that meant it cost him something to keep it that way. "Sergeant First Class Darius Len. 8 months ago, IED outside Kandahar. Forge was in the vehicle. And you took Forge after." "I was Len's team leader. There wasn't going to be a shelter for a dog like him." The way he said it made clear he found the alternative unthinkable. "We worked together 2 years before Len, me and Forge. But Len was his primary." A long pause. Len raised him from a pup. Adara was quiet for a moment. Forge had looked at her during this conversation, just once, briefly, and then away. But the scan had changed. He was no longer sweeping the room. He was watching her. "He's grieving," she said. It wasn't a diagnosis exactly. It was just the word that was accurate. "That's what the base vet said. I wanted a second opinion." Shaw's voice had an edge to it now, but it was the kind of edge that covers something softer underneath. Everyone keeps saying it like it's the answer, like naming it fixes it. "It doesn't," she agreed, "but it tells you where to start." She reached slowly into the supply tray on the counter and picked up the thermometer. She held it still for a moment so Forge could see it. Not pointing toward him, just visible. Something to register, not react to. "I'm going to need to get closer," she said. "To Shaw, not to the dog. I want you to let him make that choice. Don't pull the leash, don't give him a command. Just let him decide what to do." "He might." "I know," she met Shaw's eyes. "Let him decide." Shaw's grip on the leash stayed tight for 3 full seconds. Then, slowly, he loosened his fingers. He didn't let go, but he gave the line slack. Adara turned back to Forge. She'd spent 4 years as a civilian contractor at Fort Belvoir before the accident, 4 years working in the K9 training pipeline, learning the systems, the vocabulary, the specific grammar of the way military working dogs were trained. Belgian Malinois from the Netherlands breeding programs, Czech Shepherds, the reward structures, the command languages, the precise pitch and cadence that told a dog something different from anything it had heard from a stranger before. She had learned to speak a dog's language long before she learned to treat one. She let out a slow breath, and then she said, quietly and clearly, in a particular cadence that meant nothing to anyone else in the room, the word that meant ease, not the English command, not the civilian version, but the specific combination of sound and tone that a Malinois trained in the JJJTC pipeline recognized as permission to come down from the posture it held. Forge went still. It was the kind of stillness that happened after something the body had been braced for stopped. His ears came up. His head came forward a fraction of an inch. Shaw made a sound that was not quite words. Adara stayed crouched. She didn't extend her hand. She let the air between her and Forge be quiet. Forge stood up. He stepped forward 1 pace, then stopped, then another. His nose came down to her knee, and she didn't move, didn't breathe differently, and he exhaled, a long, slow exhale that she felt against her scrubs, and then he pushed his head against her chest, the full weight of it, the way a dog does when it's not asking for something but is offering everything it has left to give. Behind her, she heard Sergeant First Class Breckin Shaw, who had survived 3 deployments and a decade of things she would never fully know, make a sound that a lot of people would have mistaken for a cough. She put her hand on the back of Forge's neck, gently, at the place where a handler would rest a palm to tell a dog it had done something right. She stayed there a minute. The dog's whole body settled, the rigid line of his spine softening by degrees, the angle of his ears dropping from alert to something closer to rest. She didn't look at Shaw. She gave him the dignity of not being watched right then. When she finally straightened, she gave Forge a moment to adjust, then stood and moved back to her position near the counter. Forge sat down at Shaw's feet, not pressed against him the way he'd been, slightly apart, but watching the room differently. The scan was gone. He was just sitting. "How did you?" Shaw stopped. "Started over. What did you say to him?" "A word from his training. She pulled off one glove. The program that trains dogs like Forge uses a specific command language for transition when they want the dog to move from working posture to a resting state. Not the commands most handlers use day to day. It's a reset. Shaw was staring at her. Where did you learn that? Fort Belvoir. I spent 4 years in the K9 pipeline as a training contractor before I transitioned into clinical work. She set the used glove down. I worked with probably 60 dogs that went through programs like Forge's. I know the vocabulary. Shaw was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than conversations usually allow. His hand had dropped to Forge's head, finally, the way it probably always wanted to go, and had been held back from out of the strange helplessness of not knowing what to do. He hasn't let anyone touch him like that, Shaw said, not accusing, just saying it out loud like a fact he needed to look at, since Len. He's been waiting for someone who could tell him it's okay to come down. Adara said it carefully. He's been in working posture for 8 months because nobody's been able to give him that signal. Not because there's something wrong with him, because he needed someone who spoke the right language. Shaw's hand moved slowly over Forge's ear. The dog leaned into it, not much, just slightly, but he didn't pull away. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with him, Shaw said, and the quiet in his voice made it clear he wasn't talking about feeding schedules or behavioral protocols. I keep thinking if I do everything right, he'll come back. But I'm not Len. I can't be Len. No, Adara said, you can't. It wasn't a gentle thing to say. She said it gently anyway, which was different. He knows that, she continued. He's known since the beginning. The problem isn't that you're not Len. The problem is that neither of you has been able to grieve him yet. Forge has been trying to take care of you. You can see it in how he positions himself, and you've been trying to hold it together for him, and neither of you has had a minute to just fall apart. Shaw didn't respond to that. He was still looking at Forge. Dogs don't have a concept of stoicism, she said. They experience loss, and they feel it, and they process it. But they need permission. They need the person they trust most to tell them it's all right to feel it. She paused. He trusts you. He's been trying to reach you, but you've been locked down and he doesn't know how to get through. The silence in the room after that was a different quality entirely from the silence at the beginning. Forge had his chin on Shaw's knee now. Shaw's hand was at the back of his neck in the same place Adara had put hers, and the dog's eyes had gone half closed. He ate a little last night, Shaw said finally. First time in almost 2 weeks he finished a bowl. Tell me what changed. Shaw was quiet for a moment. I'd been watching a video, one of Len's from before. His family sent me a drive after. I hadn't looked at any of it until last night. Another pause. I sat on the floor and watched it. Forge got in my lap. Adara nodded. She didn't say anything. 75 pounds of dog in my lap, Shaw said. There was something in his voice that was almost, not quite, but almost, the beginning of a smile. He hadn't done that since we were stateside 2 years ago. Because you finally let him in. Shaw looked at her. I was crying, he said flatly, like he was daring her to make something of it. I know, she said. That's what I mean. Dr. Olin came in 20 minutes later for the physical examination. Forge's blood work would take a day to confirm, but his temperature was normal, his heart rate even, his weight down 4 pounds from his last recorded check, but not dangerously. There was no physical injury, no infection, no hidden pathology to find. He was a healthy dog who had lost someone he loved and hadn't known how to come back from it. When they were done, Shaw clipped Forge's leash back on, loose this time, more habit than restraint, and stood in the exam room doorway for a moment. Fort Belvoir, he said. Why'd you leave? Car accident, Adara said. Couldn't do field work anymore. Took some time, then went back to school for vet tech certification. She said it without drama, because by now it was just a fact of her life the way most things eventually become. Shaw looked at her in a way that was different from how he'd looked at her when he walked in. Like the category she'd been filed under had been quietly reclassified. He's going to be okay? He asked, and she understood that he meant both of them. I think so, she said. I think you both are, but you have to stop trying to hold everything together all the time. He can feel it. She glanced at Forge, who was watching Shaw with a steady, patient attention. He's not fragile. He just needs you to be honest about where you are. Shaw nodded once, The kind of nod that was acknowledgement and promise at once. At the front desk, Adara wrote her direct line on the back of a clinic card. Not standard practice, but she did it anyway. She told him to call if Forge's eating didn't normalize in the next week, if the pacing got worse, if anything changed. Shaw looked at the card for a moment before he put it in his breast pocket. "You were the first person he's gone to," he said, voluntarily, since Len. Adara looked at Forge one more time. He was sitting at Shaw's left heel now, in the old working position, but his posture was different from when he'd arrived. Something looser in his shoulder line, the ears angled forward instead of flat. "He didn't pick me," she said. "He picked the closest thing to what he needed. I just happened to be the one who could give it." Shaw considered that. "Doesn't that amount to the same thing?" She thought about it. "Maybe," she said. Either way, it was his choice. They left through the front door, the big dog and the soldier, and the woman with the tabby cat at the end of the row watched them go with an expression that suggested she wasn't quite sure what she'd witnessed, but felt somehow certain she'd seen something important. The receptionist, whose name was Gail and who had been at that desk for 30 years and had seen quite a lot, waited until the door closed before she turned to Adara. "What happened in there?" she asked. Adara thought about it. About the dog pressing his full weight against her chest like a door finally falling open. About the soldier with the controlled voice and the loosened grip. About the way Forge had sat down at the end. Not tense, not scanning, just sitting. "I think they're going to be all right," she said. "I think they both just needed someone to tell them it was okay to put things down for a minute." Gail looked at her with the flat assessment of a woman who had seen 30 years of things, come through a veterinary clinic's front door and knew which ones mattered. "You couldn't have just said that to them when they walked in?" she asked. "You have to earn the right to say something like that." Adara picked up the folder from the counter, and they had to be ready to hear it. She walked back down the hall toward the kennels, where 3 dogs and a recovering tabby were waiting for the rest of their afternoon. Behind her, through the glass front door, she could see Shaw loading Forge into the back of a truck in the parking lot. Taking his time about it, not in the brisk, efficient way he'd arrived, but slowly, letting the dog take the step at his own pace. Forge looked back once before he jumped in, not at the clinic, at the spot where Adara had been standing in the exam room. Then he turned and settled himself in the crate, and Shaw closed the door, and they drove away. Adara stood in the hallway for a moment after she couldn't see the truck anymore. There was a particular feeling she'd learned to sit with over the years. The feeling of having given something real to someone who had needed it without knowing how to ask. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was more like recognition. The understanding that sometimes the most important thing you could offer another living creature wasn't a cure or a command or a solution. Sometimes it was just the right word, said in the right way, at the right moment. Sometimes it was simply the willingness to stay in the room until the door finally opened. She had learned that from the dogs. She supposed she always had.